Hey everyone, and welcome to this workshop all about how to write advanced rhetorical analysis commentary. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Beth Hall. I go by Coach Hall Writes on YouTube and TikTok, and I am an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas. In today's session, we're going to be talking about some different tips that have helped my students become more successful with their rhetorical analysis commentary. Some of these are tips I've talked about in some of my YouTube videos, but I think these are the things that can help students the most, especially as we prepare for the AP Lang exam. Thank you so much for joining me for this session. I do want to let you know of a couple upcoming sessions that I'm going to be offering. Two of them are going to be with Tim Freitas from the Garden of English. We've been doing some study sessions for students here on Light Hall. The next one is going to be April 18th. That's a Monday night. And then we're doing one the night before the AP Lang exam. So that's going to be May 9th. So the next upcoming one will focus on argument and synthesis questions. And then the night before the exam, it's kind of like a free-for-all. We did it last year. We had so much fun answering students' questions. Also, I'm going to be leading another session very similar to this, where it's an argument workshop on April 26th. That's actually my birthday. So if you want to learn more about how to write an argument essay and kind of go through a lesson and have a Q&A session and possibly be able to win a free tutoring session, or if you just want to hang out with me on my birthday, then definitely sign up for the April 26th workshop. That one, there's a link for it in the description box below, along with the workshops that I'm doing with Tim Freitas as well. So you can find all the links in the description. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our first tip, and that is to analyze the passage chronologically. So chronologically means that we're analyzing it in order. And part of the reason why we do this is because we want to follow the writer's line of reasoning. So a line of reasoning is basically the logical progression of ideas. And we need to remember that when writers or speakers are constructing their speech, their letter, their article, whatever it is that we're reading, then they make choices in a certain order because they want their speech, letter, article, whatever it is, to be as effective as possible. And so because they made those choices in a particular order, we want to examine the speech or the article, passage, whatever it is, in that same order, as opposed to just trying to find the same device throughout the whole passage. Analyzing chronologically means that we're going to divide the passage up into sections. Now, for some of the longer passages that I've seen on the AP Lang exam, I usually have students divide it into 3 parts: the beginning, middle, and end. Now, for some of the shorter passages, you could probably divide it in half. And remember that the sections do not have to be even. So it's not that you have to divide it into exact thirds or exactly in half, but rather we're looking for a shift or some kind of change in either choice, topic, tone. And so in order to do this effectively, you have to actually read the passage first. You might notice some shifts as you're reading, and it's okay to mark them, but I have found that it's usually easier to read the passage first and just kind of annotate any major observations you have, and then go back through after you've read it and divide up the passage. Now, as you're writing the essay, you don't want to actually refer to it as the first section. You can, however, as we're about to talk about, refer to it as the beginning. So one thing we want to keep in mind is that the College Board chooses quality passages. The passages are all approximately 600 to 800 words in length, and they choose passages that have a sound line of reasoning. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has super obvious rhetorical choices all the time, because I do think some passages that have been on the exam are a little bit trickier than others, but there is definitely a clear order. And so we want to think about how the writer is making certain rhetorical choices to convey their message, develop their argument, or achieve their purpose. Those are the phrases that we're going to see on the exam. So we want to be really comfortable with message, argument, and purpose. So a message is kind of like the overall takeaway, maybe a lesson or a moral. Usually a message is sometimes inspirational or encouraging, whereas an argument is meant to be persuasive. Now, all passages have a purpose, at least in my opinion. So we want to always be thinking about, why is the writer or speaker writing this? Why are they doing what they're doing in order to accomplish their goal? So because the College Board chooses passages that have a line of reasoning, we want to follow that line of reasoning as we analyze chronologically. Because if you do that, then you create your own line of reasoning as well. And that's one of the things readers look for. They look for a well-structured essay. So here are some sentence frames that you can use in order to create a chronological analysis. So I use sentence frames with my students in a variety of ways. These ones are the simpler ones that we're going to talk about today, and the other ones in the rest of the presentation are a bit more advanced. But if you haven't tried a chronological analysis yet, here is a good starting point for you. So as I said, you want to look for shifts or movements in topic, choice, and tone. And so you can use these as topic sentences if you want to, and you can change up the wording a little bit, but you could say that the speaker begins by, and then after that, you would finish with some choice that they're making. So maybe the speaker begins by telling an anecdote, or the speaker begins by repeating the phrase yesterday. So whatever it is that you notice that they're doing, you can include that there. And so there's lots of ways to finish that sentence. You could say the speaker begins by acknowledging something or claiming something, if you will. So then if we're talking about the middle of the passage, we could say the speaker continues by, because this implies that they've already done something and now they're doing something else, making a different choice. And then the speaker concludes by. And we want to analyze chronologically because a lot of passages, though not all, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but a lot of passages build to a call to action. Because honestly, in many cases, if the speaker's trying to be persuasive, they're going to make certain choices before they actually ask the audience to act in some way. So if you think about some of the conversations that you might have had, maybe with a friend, a teacher, parent, guardian, and you've wanted to convince them of something, in a lot of cases, you probably didn't come right out and ask for exactly what you wanted, because then they might have been more likely to say no. So you might have had to talk them into it. And if you did that, then you made some rhetorical choices. So we have these 3 sentence frames here that can be altered if needed, but this will help you think about the passage in sections, which will allow you to analyze chronologically. Now, one question that my students often ask is, okay, what if I divide the passage into 3 parts, but I can only have 2 body paragraphs? Because sometimes students just don't have time for more than 2 body paragraphs. Let's be honest, it's a 40-minute essay. And so because of that, we want to perhaps combine some of this. So maybe we talk about the beginning and the middle in one paragraph, or maybe it's the middle and the end in one paragraph. But we do want to try to examine the whole passage. We don't want to just start in the middle. We want to actually think about the different movements, or we don't want to start at the end and work our way backwards either. So we want to follow the line of reasoning there. But 2 paragraphs is totally fine for the body of a rhetorical analysis essay, as long as you develop them well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here are some more sentence frames. I apologize for the blue writing not having a blue bullet point. I made this on Canva and it was not cooperating with me, but I wanted to have a little bit of variation of color. So this is the best I could do. And so these 3 sentence frames are ones that I would consider a little bit more advanced than the previous ones. They sort of function in the same way. They're just a little bit more detailed. And so if you've never used sentence frames like this, the way that I typically do it is I put certain words in all caps. You can see purpose and speaker are in all caps. And that's because I want students to plug in the specific information from the passage. So where it says purpose, I would want students to tell me what the overall purpose of the passage is where it says purpose. And for speaker, that could also be the writer. I would want you to include their name, usually their last name, because we refer to authors by their last name after we've used their full name once. So let's say we're talking about Madeleine Albright. We would call her Madeleine Albright. And then after that, we could just call her Albright. You don't need to call her Ms. Albright or anything like that. So that's what the all caps means. Now, the ellipses or the 3 dots, that just means finish the sentence. So basically, it's a sentence starter and you have to input your own ideas. The reason why I love sentence frames is because they're a way to help students articulate their thoughts. And so it's not cheating, and I suppose you could say it's formulaic, but I would tend to disagree there too, because it is a way to allow students to find their voice. And it's a way to prevent a little bit of writer's block as well, because you're at least starting to get the ideas on your paper. So let's look at this first sentence frame. It says, in order to ultimately, and then we want to think about what our purpose is. And I put the word ultimately in parentheses there simply because you don't have to use that word there. I just kind of like the way it sounds. So let's say we're talking about FDR's Pearl Harbor speech in order to ultimately convince Congress to declare war. So that was his goal. So we want to lead in with the purpose, because that's kind of starting off by saying, hey, here's why they're doing this. And then where it says speaker begins by, that tells us what they're doing. One of the things that I like to see in a topic sentence, especially for rhetorical analysis, is the what and the why. So the choice, or whatever main idea you're talking about, usually it's tied to some sort of choice, and the why, the purpose, the overall reasoning behind it. So in this one, we kind of lead in with the why first, and then we go to the what. But if you look at that second bullet point, that one's more of something we could use for our second body paragraph, because that one's transitioning. And so it says, having already, and then you're going to refer to your previous body paragraph's main idea, the speaker then, and you go into the next idea. So this one has sort of like two whats to connect, and you could include a why. You could say the speaker then does this because, and you could put the purpose in there as well if you wanted to. But let's talk about why I like this type of transition, because I think this can really help with the second or even the third body paragraph. It helps create a line of reasoning. So I have this really cheesy analogy that I came up with a while ago, and it helps some of my students, but full disclosure, I know it's cheesy. And if you can think of a better analogy or example for this, let me know, because this one's cheesy. So if you think of your body paragraphs as like separate islands, and you think that the reader is kind of traveling from paragraph to paragraph, so they're going from one island to the next. If you don't have a strong topic sentence that bridges your two paragraphs together, the reader is going to have to jump from paragraph to paragraph or island to island. You want to gently guide and transport them from island to island. So if we refer back to our previous main idea and then incorporate our new idea, it's almost like creating a link between the two paragraphs. And it's much stronger than saying another choice the writer makes is. So it's creating this bridge so that it's not as abrupt of a transition, if you will. Now, there's other ways to create transitions as well. You could say the writer shifts from this to this, and that would still create a smooth transition. But topic sentences are really important. I know there's something that you probably have been talking about since like elementary school, but topic sentences are basically like the promise of the paragraph. So if a thesis statement is the overall promise of what you're saying in your essay, then the topic sentences are the promise of the paragraph. It helps the reader know exactly what you're supposed to be arguing. So let's look at the third bullet point here. It says to further develop the argument that, so again, the ellipses there means that you need to finish it and tell us what the argument is. Now I did put a slash that says convey the message that, and I should have put an ellipses there too before the comma, but you're either going to be asked about message, argument, or purpose. So if you're asked about a message, you need to tell us what the message is, even if you already said so in your thesis, which you should have. We haven't talked about thesis statements in this workshop yet, and I don't think we really will, but just in case you need a refresher, your thesis statement needs to have two things in order to be defensible: rhetorical choices, and it should reference the message, argument, or purpose. I love to see those things together, and I like to see choices first and then message, argument, or purpose, because sometimes if you flip it and you do the purpose first and then the choices, you get some weird syntactical stuff going on. Not always, but sometimes. So we need to have the message, argument, or purpose in our thesis. It really does help the quality of our essay. And so because of that, sometimes students are like, well, I already said it. I said it once. They know what it is. I said what the message is. Or sometimes students just take what's in the prompt, and if it says a message of perseverance, they just say that in their thesis. And we want to try to be as specific as we can. Sometimes you get some clues in the prompt, but other times you have to figure it out on your own. But we want to be as precise as possible, because if you can be precise, then it proves to the person reading your essay that, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I understood this passage. Give me a higher score. So we want to make sure that we say what the message or argument actually is. And so sometimes the downside to this is the essay could feel a little bit repetitive, but you can use synonyms. So let's say the message is perseverance. You could say her message of perseverance. You could say her message of never settling or never giving up. Like, there's other ways to say it. In fact, sometimes what I do is I have my students, before they actually write their essay, I have them brainstorm, if it's the purpose, maybe like three synonyms for the purpose. So let's say it's like to motivate, to advise, to encourage. That way they have like a mini word bank that they could use. And the same thing could work for message. I already said 3 different messages that were all kind of synonyms of each other. So sometimes it helps to change out your wording a little bit. That way you're not being too redundant, but you're still making sure it's really clear, hey, this is what the message is. So we lead in with to further develop the argument that, and then it says speaker shifts from main idea 1 to main idea 2. So this is another way to kind of create that bridge from island to island if we're using our cheesy analogy, or from paragraph to paragraph. So here are 2 examples for you that you can look at to see how you might possibly use these sentence frames. Now, the thing about sentence frames is that they're a guide. You can change the wording. So if you would phrase it differently, or if you need it to be altered a little bit to fit the passage that you're talking about, that is absolutely fine. So we have one here. In order to ultimately convince Congress to declare war, FDR first notes the deliberate nature of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I underline first notes there because we don't want to necessarily say says. We want to use a stronger verb. So notes tells us what he's doing. He's acknowledging it. And also the word first there indicates that we're talking about the beginning of the passage, or at least like the first half in this case. So it references that this is somewhat early on. He does this first, and then we're going to prove that claim. So this could be, for instance, a topic sentence of the first body paragraph. Now, let's look at the orange one on the bottom, because that one could be a sentence frame for body paragraph 2, the topic sentence, I mean. So having already demonstrated that the attack was premeditated and unprovoked, FDR appeals to patriotism by acknowledging his faith in a U.S. victory. Okay, so in the beginning of that, where it says, having already demonstrated that the attack was premeditated and unprovoked are synonyms for what I said previously, which was deliberate. So I'm not using the same words there, I'm using synonyms, but I'm creating a bridge between those 2 paragraphs. And before I forget, there is a tip sheet that goes along with this video. So if you like what's on the slides, but you want it all written out for you, that will be in the description box below as well. So definitely check out that information and the upcoming seminars and workshops that we have. So now let's briefly talk about what to avoid and why. I have 3 sentences here that I see pretty often, especially with novice writers in their rhetorical analysis essays. Now, I want to be clear, if you've ever used this phrasing in your essay, it doesn't mean that it's terrible. It just means that there's room for improvement. And sometimes under pressure, we might only be able to think of these phrases. That's why I like sentence frames, is because if you use them enough, it kind of gets integrated into your memory, and then you're able to think of it on command. And so I have a quick story about this. A couple of years ago, 2020, I had 2 students that were wonderful writers, and they never really used my sentence frames because they already had their own writer's voice and they just didn't need to use sentence frames. But that year, we actually got to see our students' essays on the exam. And I looked at their thesis statements, and they used the thesis statement formula that I gave my students. And I actually, a couple of days later, asked them about it. And they said, well, under pressure, it was really hard to come up with the usual thesis statements of the same quality that we did in class. But we remembered the sentence frame, and we were able to write that very quickly. And then as we continued to write our paper, our voice came back, and we didn't have to rely on sentence frames as much. But they were like, we knew we needed a defensible thesis statement. We knew that the sentence frame was the fastest way to do it. So that's what we did. And so that's why I like the sentence frames as far as like the topic sentences as well, because my hope is that with practice, students might avoid some of these phrases that are perhaps a little bit less nuanced and have something that's stronger. But these claims could serve as topic sentences too. Okay, so now let's move on to tip number 2. So for body paragraphs, quality outweighs quantity. So that's the whole, like, should I write 2 body paragraphs or 3? Honestly, it really depends. It depends on what you want to say and how you're going to develop your paragraphs. But there's nothing wrong with 2 well-developed paragraphs. I would rather see that than 3 subpar or mediocre ones. Because if you are stretching yourself so thin that you're writing 3 really short paragraphs, perhaps your time might have been better spent writing 2 more developed paragraphs. It's all about the evidence and commentary and how you can convey that best. Okay, so here are some quick body paragraph tips that will help improve the quality of your rhetorical analysis essay. Generally speaking, we want to make sure that your topic sentence has a claim. It needs to be something that you can prove, and it should be related to your thesis. So those sentence frames that I gave you can check that off your list of things to do. You also want to provide specific evidence in the form of short embedded quotes. You can paraphrase too, but the reason why I said short embedded quotes is because we don't want to see these long sentences from the text. It's not your words. We want to see your commentary. So don't waste time copying these huge sentences, because you can use a shorter part of the sentence and embed it into a sentence of your own. It's going to sound much better anyway. The other thing is embed means that we put it into. So we don't want to just drop a sentence in our essay. So we don't want it to be a sentence ends, we have a period, and then we just have this quote there. We want at least one word before the quotation marks. It helps the essay read a lot better. It's much smoother for your reader. Now, as far as how much commentary you need, we always want to follow our evidence with commentary. And I would say at least 2 sentences of commentary. I've seen sometimes students do 4. I try to give this as a recommended range and not a rule, because sometimes if you have to force yourself to do 4 sentences, then it gets super redundant. So later on in this workshop, we're going to talk about how to make your commentary not redundant, or at least some tips to hopefully avoid that. But aim for at least 2 sentences of commentary, because the goal is that we want more commentary than evidence. And yes, you can put evidence and then commentary in the same sentence, but you still need at least 1 or 2 more sentences of commentary. So I have something that I've been calling layers of evidence and commentary. And what that means is we usually want at least 2 separate pieces of evidence, possibly even 3, to prove our claim, because it's more convincing that way. If you make a claim that the author is, let's take FDR, for example, that he is proving that it was a deliberate attack, and you just give 2 words that like sudden and unprovoked. Let's say those were in the speech. That's proof, but it's maybe not as convincing as if you had even more evidence that talks about how it was deliberate. So we want to make sure that we have a topic sentence, evidence, commentary, more evidence, more commentary, and then a concluding sentence. If you want to put a 3rd layer of evidence and commentary in your paragraph, more power to you. I usually just say 2 because that's what most students, at least my students, do, but I definitely have some students who do 3 layers. So here's the thing. With these layers, we want to make sure that we have appropriate commentary and a transition if needed between them. And we also want that concluding sentence at the end, because that's going to tie back to the main idea or the thesis. And that was something that I noticed last year when I read one of the rhetorical analysis prompts. A lot of students had their paragraphs end really abruptly. And it wasn't because they had run out of time, because I'm talking like first body paragraph too, not just like the last paragraph. And so it's almost like, even though it's a short essay, it feels incomplete, because especially for these type of essays, it's helpful if you remind your reader, hey, here's what I'm proving. Like, therefore, the person did this for this reason, not what and why. So it's not a carbon copy of your topic sentence, and there's lots of different ways to create one, but wrap up your paragraph. We don't want to preview the new main idea that's coming up in the next paragraph. Remember, we have that topic sentence that's a transition, so we refer back to the previous main idea and then introduce the new one if you want to, if you like that style. But we don't use our concluding sentence as like a trailer or a preview of the next paragraph. We use our concluding sentence to tie back to our thesis. That way, it's really clear to the person reading your essay, hey, this student has proven their claim and it relates to their thesis. Now, sometimes students want to know, what about conclusions? Because this comes up with body paragraphs. So even though a conclusion is not a body paragraph, sometimes students have to choose between writing a body paragraph, let's say a 3rd body paragraph, or a conclusion. Or maybe they have to decide between finishing their 2nd body paragraph and writing a conclusion. So here's the thing. In almost all cases, I would say the body paragraph is most important, because that's where your evidence and commentary score comes from, and that is 2/3 of your overall essay score. So I would say go for those body paragraphs, because a conclusion is not necessary. It's not required for the rubric. Now, if you are writing an out of class essay or you go to college and you have to write an essay, then yeah, you're going to want a conclusion, especially if you have more than 40 minutes. But this is viewed as a rough draft. So focus on those body paragraphs. Now, let's say you do want to have a conclusion. Maybe you have some good insight that you want to put in there, but you run out of time. Something that I've seen some of my students do is they actually took that insight and used it as commentary in their last body paragraph. And it's kind of a way to wrap up their essay. So they still got the insight they wanted to include in the conclusion, but their essay technically ended on a body paragraph. And it read well, it was fine. So one quick thing though, if you are writing and you absolutely have to move on to the next essay, or if you're writing and time is called, it's okay if your essay is unfinished. If you stop in the middle of a sentence, we grade or score rather based on what you have. So we reward you for what you do well. It's not a penalty or a gotcha of, oh, this kid didn't have a conclusion. No, we look at what's there. So you have to put the words on the page. Give us something to score. Okay, so if you want to write a conclusion, let's talk about what you can do. Now, I do have a video on this that goes into this much more thoroughly, so I put a little bit.ly link there in case you want to access it, but I'll also include the link in the description below. But one thing we want to keep in mind is that sometimes students restate their thesis and their conclusion, and that's not wrong. In fact, if you're not sure your thesis statement was defensible, then you probably should restate it in a different way, same idea, different way, in your conclusion. I've also seen some students just kind of write themselves into a better thesis in their conclusion because the first attempt at it in the intro was kind of like a really rough draft. And then as they kept going and they wrote the essay, they realized, oh, okay, this is what I want to say. Here's the deeper meaning. So that's a great way to end too, is if you have a stronger thesis. But you don't have to restate it, especially if you knew it was already defensible the first time. So in those cases, what you might consider doing is situating the issue in a broader context. So if the passage happens to be very much tied to something historical and you know the implications of that event, go ahead and reference it. So a broader context can be forward in history, or it could be backwards in history, or it could even be outside knowledge of the time period that's relevant to the passage. So the broader context can really help. So for instance, in the passage about FDR, where he gave the Pearl Harbor speech, we know that the US did enter World War II. So you might mention that because that would be part of the broader context. And if you knew other information about World War II that was relevant, maybe you're in APUSH or something, or AP World, and you have this extra info, you could perhaps include it in the conclusion as well. Now, let's say it's not a historical passage. Let's say it's a eulogy or a commencement speech, and you're like, I don't really know the historical context. Well, then take that message or argument and ask yourself, how is this relevant today? So even if the passage was from 100 years ago or 10 years ago, ask yourself, what is the message and how is it relevant today? Have we made progress? Is this still an issue? That can be situating it in a broader context as well. So you don't necessarily have to know much about the speaker or the time period, depending on the passage that might not be relevant, or you just might not know it, but you could still look at the message or argument perhaps. So again, if you want more tips on that, please check out that video because it does have some examples and it explains it in more detail. So our next tip is one that I consider to be kind of the game changer for me as a teacher and also for my students, and that is connecting the rhetorical choice to the rhetorical situation. Now, I've done some videos on this. I've done videos on what a rhetorical choice is and what the rhetorical situation is, but I've also done videos more recently about this exact topic. But I wanted to mention it in this workshop because this is something that as I was reading last year for one of the RA prompts, I kept thinking, man, some of these essays are a 3 out of 6, but they're really close to a 4 out of 6, but there's just something missing. They're not connecting to the message, argument, or purpose enough. It just wasn't explicitly there. Maybe it was implied. Because you got to remember, there is a range on the rubric. So even though there are up to 4 points for evidence and commentary, you could score a 2 in evidence and commentary, and it could be toward the lower end of that 2, barely above a 1. Or it could be really high on the spectrum of the 2, It could be almost a 3, but you just didn't quite do enough to bump up to the next point. Because remember, we reward you for what you do well. So there is a range in this. So we want to make sure that we are looking at the 3 and 4 in row B, because we want, with our thesis point, we want hopefully a 4 out of 6 or higher. That's going to demonstrate the level of writing that we want to see for an essay like this. Okay, so what does this all actually mean? Well, the rhetorical situation is the situation, as the name suggests, from which the text arises. So there are 6 components: the speaker, the audience, the context, exigence, purpose, and message or argument. So if you are familiar with the acronym SPACE-CAT, that's the one that I use, then the space part of SPACE-CAT is the rhetorical situation. So you have your speaker, your purpose, your audience. Context is like, I define it as like historical context. Usually it's what's happening like locally or nationally, internationally at the time. And it also kind of like before, during, after, kind of like the big picture there. Now the exigence is the catalyst. So that's like what prompts the writer to write or the speaker to speak. That is the catalyst or the impetus, if you will. So if you use a different acronym, perhaps you use SOAPSTONE, then it's speaker, and then context and exigence become occasion, audience, and purpose. So really the same kind of thing. And I think I've heard of a couple other acronyms as well, but those are the 2 most popular ones. So that's the rhetorical situation. And if you're like, I have never heard that term before and you want more details, I do have videos on this on my channel. But we're going to assume that you've at least heard of some of these words before. So let's talk about how we create commentary, because we want to have commentary related to the rhetorical situation. So first of all, the job of commentary is to explain the significance of the evidence. It's the why. It's your own insight or analysis. We don't want you to just repeat what the speaker said. We can do that ourselves. We read the passage. We want you to tell us why they did what they did. Okay? So ask yourself questions like why or how. I used to tell my students to channel their inner toddler. So they'd say, okay, the writer repeats this phrase. Why does he do that? For emphasis. Okay. Why is he emphasizing it? Well, it does this and this. Okay. So we want to keep asking ourselves why. Why is it appropriate for the audience that he repeats this? Why is it effective in this instance? So keep asking yourself why. If you're struggling with commentary, keep asking yourself why. And then another tip that goes along with this is you can use the word because is kind of the signal that like, hey, I'm getting to the why. Okay. You could also perhaps say since, depending on how you're using that word as well. Or you could use phrases like given that or considering that. I tend to use those in some of my sentence frames as well. And then we have verbs that we could use to also signal commentary. A lot of times novice writers want to use the verb shows. And there are words that are a bit more precise: demonstrates, highlights, illustrates. There are probably like 10 or 15 more that you could use depending on the circumstances, but have those in your repertoire as well. So if you find yourself writing shows a lot, use words like demonstrates or illustrates or suggests. Those are going to be a little bit stronger. Okay, so how do we connect to the rhetorical situation? Like I said, the prompt is going to ask you about the message, argument, or purpose. You don't want to ignore this. In fact, I would like underline it or circle it on your paper, because you want to make sure, am I answering the prompt? There's this old joke that AP stands for answer the prompt, which it doesn't. It stands for advanced placement. But you get the idea. It's really important that you actually answer the prompt. So don't ignore what you're being asked to connect it to. And the other thing is I would refer to that at least once, if not twice per paragraph, maybe once in sort of like the heart of the body paragraph, and again in the concluding sentence or something. Now that's just perhaps like a rough estimate or recommendation. It doesn't have to be exact, but I have read essays where the student identified a choice and they kind of said why the writer made that choice, but they never actually connected it to the message, argument, or purpose. And that's what the prompt was asking. So we want to make sure that you are showing the person reading your essay, hey, I understood the passage and I understand the task. Now you might be thinking, but what if it's a super hard passage and I didn't really understand it? Do the best you can. but we still want to be connecting it to the message, argument, or purpose, like, because that's the task. So even if you're like a little shaky on the passage, let's say you're stressed or it's a hard passage, if you at least attempt to do that, your essay will be better off for it, especially than if you hadn't done that. Okay, so we want to explicitly mention the message, argument, or purpose in each body paragraph. And we talked about how we can use synonyms so it doesn't seem as repetitive. So let's talk about some different questions we can ask ourselves to connect to the rhetorical situation. I've included some of these questions in videos previously, but these are questions that I ask my students as we are approaching a passage. That way we can start to make these connections. So first of all, I might ask, whoops, it looks like I skipped to 2 slides. Sorry about that. We'll go back one. So about the speaker, we might ask ourselves, what are the speaker's credentials? Now, sometimes this is actually provided for you. So they might tell you that the person's an activist or president or a social worker or secretary of state. And so we want to use that information and actually think about, okay, how does that make them a credible source? Or how does that affect their role in the situation? We could also ask ourselves what adjectives we would use to characterize the speaker. So are they matter of fact? Are they compassionate? Are they bold? Because you can use these adverbs and adjectives to characterize the speaker in your paragraphs, and it makes it more precise and more interesting. We'll talk about that in a little bit because that's an upcoming tip. We also want to think about the speaker's needs, beliefs, desires, or values. So you don't have to think about all 4. And I know there is a little bit of overlap in these terms, but this was based on one of the standards for AP Lang. So we have to remember that speakers tailor their message to their audience, but they also stay true to who they are in some sense. And so if a speaker is advocating for something or arguing for or against something, chances are that is tied to their needs, beliefs, desires, or values, and it's going to influence their rhetorical choices. Now, in the same regard, the audience also has needs, beliefs, desires, or values. Even if it's a single audience, like a one-person recipient of a letter, or it's a whole crowd of people, chances are they have some shared needs, beliefs, desires, or values. They could desire freedom. They could desire justice. They could desire to improve their quality of life, whatever it is. They could value patriotism. They could desire independence. Thinking about this will help us understand that speaker and audience connection. We also want to think about whether or not the audience is reluctant, or are they a friendly audience? How receptive are they going to be to that message or argument? Because if they are a friendly audience, then the person's not going to have to work as hard to persuade them. But if they are a very reluctant audience, then the person's rhetorical choices are probably going to be different because they're going to tailor it to a reluctant audience. It's kind of like, let's say you have 2 friends and one of them, is definitely going to want to go to, let's say, a football game on Friday night. You're not going to have to work as hard to persuade that friend because maybe they really like football. So you would steer the conversation in that direction. But let's say that your other friend doesn't like football and it's going to be cold, maybe even a little bit rainy. They're not going to want to sit out there for 2 hours. So you're going to have to maybe mention other things to convince them to go to the game. Whereas the friend that likes football, you might have to just say, hey, it's going to be a great game, close game, can't wait to watch it. And that person's like, sure, count me in, let's go. But the other person, you might have to really persuade them and maybe talk about how you'll buy them, I don't know, a hot chocolate or something, whatever it is. So if you have a friendly audience, you're going to use certain rhetorical choices. And if you have a reluctant audience, you're going to use certain rhetorical choices. So keep that in mind as well. We also want to think about why the person is speaking. So is it a specific event that they're responding to? Are they speaking at a convention? What is prompting them to speak? And also what's going on in the world at the time? And again, if you're like, hey, I like these questions, I want to remember them, there is a tip sheet in the description box below that you will have access to. It will have you make your own copy of the documents. And so teachers, you're more than welcome to edit it and have it suit your students' needs. Students, same thing. but it's just something that I would like to provide to you guys. That way you can have this information if you find it useful. Okay, so here is a tip that I think can help in certain instances. First of all, we want to always be analyzing why the choice is effective, but there is kind of like a flip side to this that I sometimes have my students think about. And that is, why would another choice be less effective? So for instance, I like to do this with the Abigail Adams letter. If you're not familiar with that one, Abigail Adams writes a letter to her then preteen son, John Quincy, who is abroad with his father. They're in France. His father's a diplomat. He's not yet president. And we know from the beginnings of the letter that John Quincy was very reluctant to go. And so toward the middle of the letter, Abigail Adams, his mom, tells him of this comparison that she had heard from somebody. And it's comparing a judicious traveler to a river. And basically she says that the farther a traveler gets from his source, it's kind of like the farther a river gets from their source. A river gets farther from its roots or its source, and it gains nutrients. And so therefore we can assume that the traveler would get nutrients as well, perhaps experience, knowledge, things like that. And it fits his situation because he's traveling to France. So I often ask my students, okay, why does she not just tell him, by going to France, you will gain experience and knowledge? Because that'd be a whole lot simpler. Why put this metaphor in there? And my students will kind of think about it and they'll say, well, she was already kind of probably really abrupt with him because of how she wrote the beginning of the letter. She probably already told him all of this in person. And so maybe this is a softer approach. Or other students will say, yeah, but if she said it that directly, the way that you just said it, then he probably would crumple up the letter and throw it overboard or something. He would toss it in the trash. He wouldn't want to read it, because then it's kind of like a nagging parent and not like somebody who seems like they're really caring about the fact that you might not want to go. So whatever the reason is, we know that she could have left the metaphor out and just been super direct with him, but it probably wouldn't have gotten him to make the connection on his own. So that's probably what she wanted him to do, is realize, oh, hey, I'm the traveler. I'm away from my source. I can gain knowledge and experience. But instead of telling that to him, she kind of lets him connect the dots. So that might be one quick example of how we could look at the choice they didn't make versus the choice that they did. And we don't want to overuse this tactic. So we don't want to see this in every paragraph, like, oh, they could have done this, but instead they did this. But if you have a clear example of hey, I really understand why they made this choice and not another one, then go for it. You can perhaps mention, hey, they could have done this, but it wouldn't have worked because, so instead they did this, and here's why that choice is better. So as we're analyzing why choices are effective, we really want to ask ourselves, why is this choice appropriate for this audience on this occasion? So we're connecting we're connecting the choice to the audience and the occasion. So speaker, audience, context, exigence. And if you like this idea of looking at a choice that would have been less effective, then on this particular slide, I have a couple sentence frames for you that you could use if you wanted to try this tactic. But again, don't overuse it. Our final tip for today is that we want to incorporate rhetorically accurate verbs, and we want to add adjectives and adverbs in order to make our writing more precise. So if we say something like, the writer claims, that's true, and it's better than saying the writer says. But what if we said the writer emphatically claims? That's going to be stronger. Or the writer boldly argues, or the writer patriotically contests that. Or instead of saying the writer uses logos, because that sounds a little bit cheesy, what if we say the writer reasonably demonstrates or logically demonstrates? Then we have more precise vocabulary. We also want to avoid lower level words, and this applies to all essays, not just rhetorical analysis, but good, bad, thing, a lot, huge, big. Those are words that we can use a synonym for to make it more precise. And if you are more precise, then it builds that trust with the person reading your essay, because you're adding to not only your style, but you're showing them, hey, I understood the passage. Okay, so let's go ahead and practice. So for this particular example, we're going to be looking at the first portion of Madeleine Albright's commencement speech. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read you the entire beginning, but we have these 6 paragraphs here. So if you were to have time to read this, I would say, okay, go ahead and read it. And then which choices did you notice? Because this is the beginning of the speech. Remember, we divide it chronologically. Well, you might tell me that you notice examples, contrast, and repetition. And this is where when students are doing a chronological analysis, they get a little bit confused. They're like, well, I saw 3 things. And so how do I have 3 main ideas? Or do I choose one? What do I do? You want to choose the one that you feel like you could write about the best, or the one that's the most prominent. So let's talk about the examples. Now, I know that you might not have previously read this particular speech, so just bear with me on this because I want to make sure I'm sticking to our time limits. But we want to ask ourselves, what do these examples have in common? Well, in the beginning of her speech, she uses examples that are recent world affairs. And in each example that she gives, she talks about how we, presumably the US and possibly in some cases other nations, could have stagnated or stopped, but instead we progressed. So we kept going. And we want to connect it to her message. Well, it seems like she's favoring progress or perseverance. So when we see examples, sometimes speakers do like one major example, kind of like the anecdote that kind of like the comparison that we were talking about with Abigail Adams. That was a pretty important part of her letter. She didn't give a bunch of analogies. She gave one, and it was meaningful. So if there's one example, unpack that meaningful example and ask yourself, why did the speaker choose this example? But sometimes speakers add like multiple examples that are related to prove the same point. And so sometimes they go for the quantity of the examples. And that's kind of like what Madeleine Albright did here. So we want to ask ourselves, like, why are these examples effective? Well, one of the reasons why they're effective is because they were examples that the audience knew about, because they were recent. So here's where we can look at that other choice idea. So I ask my students when we do this particular speech, why would examples from a different time period, such as, say, the American Revolution, why would examples from that time period have been less effective? And my students will tell me, like, well, they didn't live through the American Revolution. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. But they read about it in history books, probably like 7 times throughout their entire education. So why not the American Revolution? People persevered then too. And they're like, yes, but they don't have a personal connection with it. Whereas she references the Berlin Wall, the peace in Bosnia, the Dayton Accords. These are all things that they not only lived through, but they were probably teenagers or even young adults when this happened. Some of them were quite recent, like 2 years before the speech. So it's much more personal to them, and they have a reference point for it, much more so than the American Revolution. So that personal connection matters. That's why that choice, those current examples, are more effective than historical examples in this case. And so if you want like kind of a connection for yourselves, it's kind of like if you have a graduation ceremony, presumably instead of talking about the American Revolution or even the Berlin Wall, people at your graduation ceremony, if they're giving a commencement speech, they might talk about COVID or Russia and the Ukraine or something like that, something more contemporary, because presumably since it's so current, there's less explanation needed because people know what happened. And so that would be one way to look at why did they make this choice instead of a different one. Okay, so here is a paragraph sample. Now, this is just a portion of the essay, and this paragraph does not do everything, but I wanted to use it to demonstrate a couple different techniques that we've talked about in the workshop today. So if you want this paragraph, it is now on the handouts that you can get, the little worksheet that I'm going to put in the description box. I did add it there because I initially didn't include it. And so here you can see that I've got it color-coded for different reasons. So in our topic sentence, it says, Albright references recent political examples in which countries could have settled but chose the more arduous path instead. So notice that I said examples in which, and I explained it, because we don't want to just stop at Albright references recent political examples, because that's true, but that doesn't really tell us anything about the examples. So remember, we want like either the what and the why, or we at least want a very specific what in our topic sentence. Also, we're looking for a more elevated word choice. And so the word arduous means difficult. So we are including some of those more precise words as well. By noting that America must choose to seize opportunities, Albright suggests the value of making challenging, sometimes trailblazing decisions, as opposed to selecting the easier, more isolating path. Okay, so noting is stronger than saying says, and sometimes we do need to say what they said, so we've got our evidence there. That's an example of an embedded quote. That was a part of the sentence. I didn't take the whole sentence. I just took the part I needed, and it's pretty short. Now, the orange there, that's talking about the message. So you can see that there's different bits of orange throughout the whole paragraph. I referenced the message or purpose multiple times in different ways. And so I worked on using synonyms, but I also wanted it to be really clear, hey, here's why she's making the choice. Ultimately, she's trying to get them to realize the value of perseverance. So we want to make sure that we have that message, purpose, or argument. Okay, so you can see other strong verbs there: introduces, echoes, allow, examine, seeks to inspire, to capitalize, serve as. Those are all just, I think, stronger words. Like, there are instances where I could have chosen a weaker word, but I tried to choose something stronger. But you also see that the word examples is mentioned throughout as well. So it's really clear that I'm trying to analyze the examples, but notice that I do have where it says contrast. So that was one of the things that we said, is we noticed examples, but we also noticed contrast. You could do this or you could do this, and they're opposites: stay the same or progress. So it's okay to include some of those other observations you have. The word echoes kind of can be used instead of repeats sometimes. So if you notice repetition, you could talk about the repetition, but it's the repetition within the examples. And the contrast that we're talking about, the stagnation versus progress, that is a contrast within the examples. So you want to ask yourself, if you see multiple things kind of happening in tandem, which one is either the one you could write about the best, or which one is sort of like the anchor and the other ones are related. So you want to focus on, like, what is the major thing the person's doing in the beginning here. So this is just a quick example. Again, this is just a portion. It's a paragraph. It's not the entire essay. But there are a couple other things that we talked about in our workshop today that I tried to demonstrate here. So for instance, where it says, including the destruction of the Berlin Wall and recent peace in Bosnia, we want to be specific. That's paraphrased evidence. I'm referencing the text, but I'm not quoting it. But then here, events the graduates of Mount Holyoke are likely familiar with. Remember, we had to ask ourselves, why did she choose these examples? And we said, well, they're familiar with it. Put that in your essay. We need the what and the why. Okay, so we have that reference there to the graduates, so I know who her audience is. I know why she made that choice for that audience. So again, we've got like a little speaker audience connection there. And so those questions I demonstrated on previous slides, you don't have to include all of those questions in one body paragraph. That's one of the ways to develop your commentary, is you can focus on different elements of that in each body paragraph. Now, one more thing, we had talked about the speaker's credentials. Well, I think I could have perhaps explained this a little bit more clearly in the paragraph, but we know that she was Secretary of State. That was her title. Female speaker who is a very high up politician speaking to a group of female graduates. So we've got that connection there. Presumably they might find her inspirational. Okay, and they would have known who she was. She was kind of a big deal at the time. And so because of that, that subtle reference here to her credentials as Secretary of State, that's kind of weaving in her credentials in the paragraph in a way that's not like, oh, she was Secretary of State, but we do reference it. So perhaps I could have talked about how she was a powerful female trying to empower other powerful females, But really realistically, I probably would have saved that realization for like the end of the passage and why they found her message inspirational, or why she chose that message for a commencement speech. So that's the other thing, is we want to kind of spread out our insights. We want a developed paragraph. We have layers of evidence and commentary here. We have some embedded evidence, we have some paraphrased evidence, but we don't want to like throw everything in. That way we are so repetitive than in the next paragraph. We want to kind of balance it out. And this does take practice, but that's why those questions can be helpful, is because it helps you raise different points as you analyze chronologically. Okay, so that is the end of the workshop for today. So if you haven't already done so, definitely double check the description box for the handout that goes with this. You'll also find more information about upcoming sessions. I would love for you to join us on the 18th and May 9th, or April 26th for the argument workshop. All of them are here on lighthall.co. So you register, they're totally free. So make sure that you tell your AP Lang teacher, your AP Lang friends. If you are a teacher, please share it with your students if you think it would benefit them. And also just double check everything in the description box in case you want additional resources as well. I'll link information about videos and things like that. And of course, if you're not already subscribed here on YouTube, or if you're a TikTok user, I would love for you to follow me there too. Then please do so, because I want to help you as much as I can as we prepare for the upcoming Lang exam. All right, so thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy writing.